Good afternoon. My name is Benjamin Hagwood, and today I will be presenting you my research paper on the review of Chester Bernard's The Function of the Executive. Let's get right into the presentation. Before I do, I'd like to stop for a second and give you a brief preview on the information we'll be covering. First and foremost, we'll look at a biography of Chester Bernard. Then we'll roll right into examining the text in which he offers his theory. Afterwards, we'll look at contemporary ways that management can be impacted by utilizing this theory. Then we'll take a look at the Christian perspective that exists. Finally, I'll leave you with some of my personal thoughts on management, and that will be the end of the presentation. Chester Bernard was born November 7th, 1886, and lived into June 7th, 1961. Well-established man, he was a businessman first and foremost, not a theorist. He was not a managerial theorist. He worked directly with AT&T, and that is one reason why his text is so highly renowned. He has a lot of experience in the field, which he then applies in text, which gives us more of a sense that he understands the way, the simple nuances that exist for management, which is the reason why I definitely prefer his text over a lot of other managerial text. Now, the one thing I do want to say about him is he's a Harvard graduate with economics and that he worked at AT&T, then went on to become the president of the New Jersey Telephone Company. Now that I've told you a little bit about Chester Bernard, let's talk about his text. In Functions of the Executive, he divides his theories into four main sections, each section beginning to unfold for us the exact definition of what it means to be a manager or an executive. The first section, he looks at psychology. He indicates that in an organization, psychology is the information that lets us know the behavior types, as well as the temperaments, as well as the personalities that exist in individuals that determine whether or not they will be a good fit for the organization itself. After he explains that, he goes directly into defining formal organizations. And the first definition that he gives us is he explains that there are two different types of formal organizations. You have cooperative organizations, which is multiple individuals working together to accomplish a goal, and more abstract systems. These abstract systems are not as well defined, and generally they do not come up as often because cooperative systems is the main one that we focus on. After defining them, he then gives us the theory behind them as they exist, indicating that corporations or systems are made up of units, and units are individuals that exist in smaller groups that make up larger groups that all work towards the same goal. Then he goes on to tell us that there are structures that exist, certain ways that organizations position themselves, whether you're a hierarchical structure or whether you're a more flat structure, and the way the information is disseminated throughout the entire organization is critical to an organization's ability to be proficient, effective, and efficient. The third part of his book and the theory that he talks about would be the elements of formal theory, in which he talks about specializations, incentives, and authority. Specializations are is every little thing about work, where we do work, who does the work, who you do that work with. It is all of the details that goes into the way that we structure the work that we do to get the end product. Now, when we're doing that product, we learn from a psychological standpoint that when you give something, you return something. So he said, along with getting those individuals that specialize in doing certain things, we have to give them things in order to entice them to come work for the organization and to give their all. The thing we give them would be incentives. Now, he indicates that there are several kinds of incentives that we can give. You can obviously give monetary incentives, which is generally the type of incentive that we give to individuals, or you can give coercive incentives, which he strongly indicates we should not at all look at coercive incentives. Coercive incentives, although they may get you the end task, first and foremost, it probably won't lead to having a positive or a worker that is fulfilled entirely with their position because of the fact that they may feel as if they're being underutilized or they're being abused at their workplace, which means that we should probably either look at monetary or the final form of incentive that we can give, which is a persuasive incentive. You can give them something that they want. You can try to make them aim for goals that benefits both themselves and the organization, and that is critical to a manager's ability to sustain not just their role as the leader, but also the relationship between themselves and their employees. We understand that from a psychological or social science perspective, when you have certain relationships that exist, whether those relationships are professional, social, or private, all of those relationships still demand a certain amount of expectancy. And from that expectancy, we need to be able to resolve internal issues before we begin to actually ask for something else from an individual, which means that authority comes into play at this point, because authority indicates that you have certain things, like you have legitimate power over your employees by the fact that they simply work for you. But that does not necessarily mean that because you give them a command, they will follow it. People are more likely to follow people that they perceive themselves having a good relationship with and they are willing to work with, which means that when we work hand in hand with our employees, when we as managers step up to the plate and make sure that our responsibilities are taken care of first and foremost, that we're able to resolve a lot of the conflict that exists in the organization, which is critical to our role that we play in the organization. Because as Bernard indicates, that organizations themselves always fail. He says the only organization that has been able to exist throughout time has been the Roman Catholic Church. All other organizations seem to just be popping up, or they are remnants of other organizations that have failed. So taking that perspective, we have to understand that our role as managers is crucial. Now, the final part of his book talks specifically about the executive and the role that the executive has, as well as the responsibilities that the executive has. It goes through three steps. First is the function, which indicates that there are certain things that the manager is just expected to do. It's certain roles that they're expected to fulfill, whether that is a leadership role, whether that is a kind of like the mascot role, or whether it is a role specifically in which they are the creative force behind the organization. Then he talks about executives have to participate in a process, and that process is that they have to be willing to work with all of the people that they are directly aligned with. We're pausing for a second. I'll redo process. One, two, three. After function, he talks specifically about process, and process indicates that there are certain things, certain ways we go about communicating with individuals as an executive. As an executive, you have to be sure that whatever creative idea you come up with, you are able to funnel it into the right area. You're able to make sure that your idea is passed on to the right individuals in order to make sure that those ideas actually become products that go out to your consumers. Even if that idea is something as simple as the overall organizational culture, that is still something that's controlled by the executive and that we have to keep in mind. The final part is responsibility. And I'm going to talk a lot about responsibility in the remaining time that I have, because responsibility determines the actions, the mindset, and the direction of the entire organization. And a manager has all the responsibility when it comes to that portion. They have to make sure they understand the way that the organization thinks, the organization will move, and the morality that exists in the organization all comes from the top. A perfect example is Enron. We remember them from a couple of years ago, and they were really pushed hard to work hard and reap the benefits of your rewards. What they did not know is at the same time, their own managers, their own executives were doing things to limit their ability to be effective in that way. So responsibility comes into play because it indicates that executives have a larger role. Bernard indicates they are the leaders of not just their organization, but of the world, because of the amount of responsibility they have, or the amount of kind of influence they have in the world. Now that we've kind of talked about his text, let's move on to contemporary, or ways that the way that Chester Bernard's book can directly influence contemporarily in management. The first one is that it creates space that allows for management to actually have relationships with its employees. These relationships can be, as stated before, professional, they can be social, or they could even be spiritual. And we're going to get to the spiritual aspect a little bit later, but I want to make sure that we understand that his book is more than just a discussion of authority of executive, but about the way that executives should be able to communicate effectively with their employees. The second point that we can take away from it as contemporary managers is that it focuses on managerial responsibility, and managerial responsibility in a world in which we are drastically seeing an increase on regulations is going to be key, that we make the right decisions on the direction to move our company. Whether or not it's always smart to opt in for a new government program is a question we have to ask ourselves. The final one is that it provides an important discussion of how far the manager should interact in his or her employees' lives. And I think that his text indicates that our interaction with them should be sufficient enough to make sure that they understand the role they have, as well as the way that we perceive not just the organization, but ourselves. Now, the next part will be a Christian perspective. And I think this is important because I think we have to look at the way that we as Christians interact with individuals. And I think there are two main principles we can take. The first and foremost would be that we need to be moral stewards. God has given us a lot. God is the ruler of everything. He has given us our abilities, our bodies, our sound minds, and he's also given us opportunities to be executives, to be managers. But that means that we need to be able to make sure that we are good stewards of the things that we have now so that God can increase in our life. We have to make sure that the things we're doing is edifying to him. And I think the way that happens is the second point, is that we have to understand to be servant leaders. Christ set the perfect example for us. And a man that is 100% man, 100% God, that is willing to get on his knees and wash a man's feet, a sinner's feet, to serve people that are sick, that are sinners, that are the outcasts of society. That is the way we should view ourselves. We should personally engage in that spiritually. And we should make sure that our role is always fulfilled that way. Now, I've taken time in this short amount of time, I know, to introduce you to Chester Bernard's text, to go over kind of his life story a little bit, to analyze the four sections of his text, indicate that, managerial responsibility is extremely important and something we should always aim to participate in. We then looked at the contemporary impacts that it has on society, and we looked at a Christian perspective. Closing thoughts I would like to leave you with is that as Christians, as people, as Americans, it's important for us to make sure that our actions we're taking are always ethical, they're always sound, and they're always edifying. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.